150 million years ago, the world was a younger, more turbulent planet. It was a time of terrifying prehistoric creatures, a time when dinosaurs ruled supreme. They were the lords of the earth. Today, children of all ages gaze and wonder at these magnificent giants. But the pioneers who discovered the first dinosaurs just 150 years ago had only a few clues to their existence. In fact, just one clue, a tooth, was to open a trail to a world no one even knew existed. Finding the world of the dinosaurs isn't easy. They roamed across every continent, but their remains, fossil bones, ended up in the remotest corners of Africa, China, Europe, and America. But dinosaur hunters, paleontologists they're called, thrill to this challenge. The excitement of a new discovery brings out the detective in all of them. Some dinosaur experts have a sixth sense. They seem to smell dinosaur bones buried in the rock.
There's something about seeing bones for the first time when you know you're the only human being that's ever seen them. It's something very special about that. And that's what I wanted to do. It's very satisfying to be able to go out and be like a detective, actually collect pieces of information and put them together and make a story.
Ken, how did you get into paleontology?
Well, I owe that to my mother, or else maybe I should blame my mother. When I was 5 years old, she took me to see the movie Godzilla. And there I saw essentially maybe not a real dinosaur, but it was pretty close to a dinosaur. And I was just so enthralled with this huge animal that was stomping around Tokyo. And I thought, dinosaurs, that's what I want to study.
You know, the history of life is this great mystery. And we're kind of like detectives, that we're given these clues. These clues are a piece of bone, like this, or little fragments of bone. And we have the rocks that those bones are in. And from that, we have to piece together what the animals looked like. We also have to figure out what were the environments, what was the world that they lived in. And that's the excitement, to be on the trail of those discoveries, to be able to piece together that whole from these little parts. I mean, that's what's the thrill to me.
Though the clues have been buried for millions of years, we've only really discovered dinosaurs quite recently. To understand the clues, today's scholars still go back to 19th century England. Okay, Bob, now you come in from the field with your specimens. Mm-hmm. What's the next step? All you got is a bunch of little things there.
Well, this is some of the haul from this last year. Dinosaur teeth, meat-eating dinosaur teeth. And the next step is to go to the documents, what other people have thought about this type of tooth. And this may surprise you. I don't go to the literature of 1990 or 1980 or 1970. I found the most exciting thing. Let's go back to the original scholars. Go back to the last century, go all the way back to 1820s, because I find their level of analysis just incredibly acute.
Back in the middle of the 19th century, the science of paleontology, the study of old bones and ancient creatures, was just being invented. A few pioneer anatomists and dedicated amateurs began finding a few teeth here, a couple of bones there, that they recognized as clues to the existence of a world far older than anyone had imagined. One man, William Buckland, was the first dinosaur detective. He had just one clue, a gigantic tooth which he acquired in 1817. To what sort of animal did such an enormous tooth belong? No such creature or teeth that size exist today. Buckland had a tooth, but nothing else, nothing to compare it with. These fellows back there in the early part of the last century had nothing to go on. Nobody knew that there were any such animals that ever existed on Earth.
Right.
They find a little thing like that. Is that what he started with? Something like that? And he says from that he builds A model of a dinosaur?
He
Come
does.
on now,
He
wait a
does. And the way he did it is elegant. It's beautiful.
That's got to be one of the great detective stories
It
of all
is.
time.
And he had two lines of detective work, and there's the same two lines we had today. He had the line of what animal today has teeth most like this one, and Buckland had there in the collection of the Royal College of Surgeons jaws of lizards, meat-eating lizards like this. This is one from India. I've been bitten by this species. Really gives you a nasty wound. So Buckland said this jaw is a gigantic version of this type of jaw. And he's right, there is a distant affinity in evolution between lizards and dinosaurs, and mechanically they're quite similar.
Buckland deduced from its shape that the tooth must belong to a giant lizard, similar but much bigger than anything on Earth today. His gigantic lizard's tooth had just one function: to kill.
And his argument, which is exactly right, is that this strong curvature on the leading edge and a concavity on the trailing edge allows the weapon to cut across its prey, just as a cavalryman strikes down with the curved tip, getting a long wound. You can look
Now,
at
what did that tell him?
It told him that this animal killed, not like a lion or a tiger, by biting once in the throat or behind the neck. This animal killed like a giant lizard would kill, making long cuts in the body of its prey, long, jagged cuts, and the prey would be weakened by loss of blood and trauma.
Buckland's genius was to imagine the tooth in the jaws of a full-size prehistoric reptile. With just one clue, he could deduce that this monster killer was 40 feet long and had the bulk of an elephant, and he was surprisingly accurate. For Buckland, a teacher at Oxford University, the tooth raised more questions than it answered. Where did the animal fit into the scheme of God's creation? What sort of animal was it? With a 19th century passion for order, Buckland concluded that the tooth so like a lizard must have belonged to a huge reptile. He named it, as we still do of all new dinosaur finds today, from the Greek. He called it Megalosaurus, giant reptile. But Buckland was also a man of God. The church insisted that the earth was thousands of years old. Buckland's Megalosaurus tooth was definitely millions of years old. At the time of the biblical flood, 2 of every species were saved. Nothing God had created could die out. But if his Megalosaur had existed, why wasn't it on the ark? While the choir rejoiced, the early dinosaur detectives viewed Genesis as a guide, not a literal timetable of life on Earth. The Bible says that that Earth, the heavens, the creatures on Earth were created 4,000 years ago. How in the world did they reconcile that? Wasn't there a lot of turmoil in their community?
There wasn't. It was a surprise. It is true that the Anglican Church has produced more great paleontologists than any other organized religion. But they weren't vulgar creationists. They didn't believe the world was created 4004 BC. Not these men. They believed the Bible was a powerful document, spiritually correct. But they believed the story of Genesis allowed enormous room for the mind of man to understand God's law, natural law. And they fully believed natural law operated for a long time to give us these creatures. And they also saw God's hand in the sequence of fossils. Here were dinosaurs, animals that combine features of rhinos and lizards and crocodiles and even a bit of bird thrown in. And before them were amphibians, frog-like salamander animals. And after the dinosaurs came the brightest and best, the highest class, our class, the class Mammalia. So they saw a progression, an increase in the perfection of organic creation.
Today, most of us have no problem reconciling science and religion. Nearly everyone accepts that our planet is millions of years old. But while we can comprehend hundreds, even thousands of years, and marvel at ancient civilizations, I, for one, have great difficulty, even as did our early dinosaur detectives, in imagining the concept of life over millions of years. How can we understand the reign of the dinosaurs 200 million years ago? Well, perhaps I can use, in this great modern city of New York, the giant World Trade Center to give us some perspective on that vast expanse of time. Here at the base, the Earth was formed 4.5 billion years ago. The first organisms emerged at 3 billion years. Worms and fish appeared 500 million years ago, and these were followed by the ancestors of mammals and reptiles 250 million years later. The dinosaurs appeared 210 million years ago, and they ruled for 150 million years. And then, some 65 million years ago, they vanished. Just 3 million years ago, we humans appeared. Our chapter is the shortest in the history of life, barely visible at the top. A year after Buckland named his tooth, a second vital clue was made public. A young country doctor, so the story goes, was making a house call. His wife came with him. While Dr. Gideon Mantell attended his patient, his wife Mary stumbled upon a second gigantic tooth. But this tooth, unlike Buckland's, was not the tooth of a killer, but that of an enormous plant eater.
A tooth like this was found first by Gideon Mantell's wife, the first clue of a giant plant-eating dinosaur. Now, what Mantell did, he looked at the tooth. It was lizard-like in form, but it had this grinding surface. Here was an extinct animal that ground its food like an ox, he said. These weren't merely giant lizards. They were doing something that no lizard does today. They're grinding their food, which implies a much higher level of metabolism, much higher lifestyle.
Buckland had found the saber-like tooth of a monstrous killer. Mantell's tooth, an entirely different shape, was clearly the tooth of a giant plant eater. Like Buckland, he had no idea what animal it was. Its long snout boasted 200 chisel-edged teeth, packed closely together to form a unique grinding surface, capable of reducing the toughest leaves and twigs to a pulp. At 33 feet long and 2 tons in weight, it browsed the woodlands like a giant antelope. The Mantells searched further. Obsessed by their find, Mantell and his wife, like all good detectives, looked for more clues. Their patience was soon rewarded.
And it was Mantell's genius that he could take small fragments, and he had bits of heads and bits of feet and whatnot, and give a sculptor the idea of a gigantic 4 or 5 ton animal that combined the features of a lizard with an elephant, with a rhinoceros, with a bird. It was a chimera. It was a wonderful mix-up series of characteristics.
The way Mantell did that was brilliantly simple. He looked for a living equivalent. What animal had a tooth similar to this find? The plant-eating iguana had, on a smaller scale, teeth the same shape as his huge reptile. Mantell, with a few teeth and bones to go on, and the iguana as a guide, gave the world its first picture of a dinosaur. Getting the bones to fit this living model was not easy. He named it Iguanodon, iguana tooth. This was no ordinary lizard. There had to be more to the story.
Buckland and Mantell concentrated on the teeth. That gave them a clue to these animals being giant fossil reptiles. What they hadn't really recognized was that in addition to the teeth were other bones, and the bones had some very distinctive characteristics. And what it took was somebody else to look at these specimens with fresh eyes. And that person was Richard Owen.
In 1841, Britain's leading scientist, Professor Richard Owen, put both monster teeth on the map. With a pinch of cunning and an eye to personal publicity, Owen, observing the anatomy of the large mammals of our day, concluded that the fossil teeth must have belonged to a whole group of giants, now extinct.
Richard Owen was a very competent comparative anatomist, very eminent in his field, and he reviewed all the fossil reptiles known in Britain at the time. And he said, yes, these are clearly giant fossil reptiles, but there's something very special about them. And that special thing is that they can walk around with their legs held directly beneath the body, not sprawled to the side, as in a typical reptile. They're in fact much more like elephants and rhinoceroses living today. And he saw them as the zenith of reptilian evolution.
At a scientific meeting in Plymouth, he named them dinosaurs, the terrible lizards.
That brought with it a certain amount of acclaim, but there was a problem there because he was describing a concept. He could explain the teeth, he could explain the bones very clearly, but there wasn't a tangible, complete dinosaur to show off these creatures.
Owen hired the leading sculptor of the day, Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, to bring dinosaurs to life. From the fragmentary evidence, Hawkins built models that thrilled Victorian England. They were destined for Crystal Palace in London. It was the first dinosaur theme park ever built, and it still attracts the public today. Ever the publicist, Owen celebrated the achievement by hosting the most bizarre dinner party ever held. On New Year's Eve, 1854, he invited the leading scientists of the day to wine and dine in the belly of Hawkins' still unfinished model of Iguanodon. Through an alcoholic haze, the world's most eminent scholars could now picture prehistory in all its terrifying glory. You might think that Central Park in the heart of New York City doesn't have much to do with dinosaurs. Well, you'd be wrong. The great British sculptor Waterhouse Hawkins, having modeled dinosaurs in England, was commissioned to come to America to build a dinosaur exhibition in Central Park. But it was not to be. Politics got in the way.
Well, on the basis of his success with the giant monsters in the Crystal Palace, he thought that he might try something of the same sort in the United States, where dinosaurs were beginning to come out of the ground. So he made arrangements to set up a museum in Central Park, which he titled the Paleozoic Museum, somewhat patterned after the Crystal Palace, that is with a big arch of glassware like an aviary, and an island in the middle with life-sized reconstructions of the animals in all their glory. Waterhouse Hawkins didn't understand New York politics. Politics in New York was then run by the Tammany Gang. William Marcy Tweed, an old fire chief who had become head of the Democratic organization, was the chief boodler, controlled the mayor, controlled the heads of departments, and so forth. Anything that happened in New York that didn't pay off for them was not going to be successful. Hawkins just failed to cross the right palms with silver. There was no profit in it for the politicians, and so they decided, this has got to stop. We can't make any money on it. And so they put the kibosh on the whole operation.
New York City boss William Tweed, through a mix of jealousy and town hall corruption, in 1871 ordered his henchmen to smash Hawkins' models with sledgehammers and to bury the pieces. To this day, they've never been found. But who knows? Hawkins' dinosaurs may be buried right here under my feet. Teeth formed the foundation for the early interpretation of dinosaurs, brought to life by sculptors like Waterhouse Hawkins in plaster and concrete. Today, more modern materials are used. Jim Gary is a sculptor who builds 20th century dinosaurs from junk which he finds in the scrapyards of America's automobiles. He adds his own interpretation to what dinosaurs ought to look like.
Wow, this is a good find. This is a '68 Cadillac. Right here we have the legs for Allosaurus, the arms, and also the head. Cut a couple of holes in here for eyes and nose, and you have a perfect head. This is a '74 Chevy. It's one of the parts that I use to make up the lower parts of my dinosaurs. This is one of the better cars to use for building dinosaurs if you're in the dinosaur business. Basically all the bigger cars and the earlier cars in the 50s and 60s make the best dinosaurs. When I first started out, they used to laugh at me, but in '78, I got to cover National Geographic, and from that point on, I was on the road. Yeah, I just finished up a show at the Smithsonian. Now I'm headed up to Rochester Museum, and then just on from there. I love working with the old parts because I can interpret them and make people think they're really looking at old bones instead of just old car parts. These are my interpretations. You can't count the vertebrae, which I've had paleontologists start to do, count the vertebrae, and I'm saying, hey, this is just my interpretation of what I think they look like. And I have a lot of fun with that because the paleontologists have to be so exact. And here I can add an extra rib or whatever it is at my whim, so it's a lot of fun.
But dinosaur detectives don't have that artistic license. From the early teeth, exhibitions like the Natural History Museum in London have built world-famous collections. Sculptors and cinema animators Use it as a reference library when building today's models. Ray Harryhausen created the monster in 1 million years BC. His Allosaurus, cousin of the infamous T-Rex, terrified Raquel Welch with its teeth. It was, of course, cinematic license, but like the dinosaur hunters of a century ago, the model makers are sure at least of one thing, that the teeth are right.
Let's have a look at it. That's
most
incredible.
interesting. There's the jaw, lower
Beautiful.
jawbone there, and
There's a
if
tactile.
you can fit that there. Look at
There
the
we go.
gap. My goodness, I don't see how they could pick up a person. But this is a small dinosaur. This is a, shall we say, a juvenile.
That's right.
There's
Seeing
a-
bones like this, I'm sure you agree, really makes you want to flesh up on them and bring them back to life.
But how do you do that from old bones? This Brachiosaurus is a gigantic dinosaurian giraffe. It came here to Berlin from an African expedition in 1911. At 35 feet high, 75 feet long, and weighing 30 tons, it is the biggest complete skeleton in the world. It's hard to imagine it fleshed up.
There are key areas where you can actually manage to put in muscles with a fair degree of certainty, particularly in the legs, both front and hind in this case, and around the girdles where the legs are supported. The reason for this is that there are very powerful muscles that run down along the sides of the leg bones, which actually allow movement to take place. Where they're attached to the bone surface themselves, they leave scars. And these scars are really quite distinctive. They leave a sculptured surface on the bone. For example, if you look at the top of the upper leg bone at the front of this animal, find a very large prominent bone. And that is where the muscles that ran across the center of the chest are found. If you add these all together, what you can do is very easily and fairly clearly put together the muscles that supported the limb in the front and also in the hind limb. And in that way, you can build up a fairly accurate picture of the way in which the muscles actually fitted together on any sort of prehistoric animal.
Hard on the heels of the dinosaur detectives have come artists and model makers. Everyone wants realistic dinosaurs now. Alice is the pet name for the juvenile Allosaurus, a 25-foot lithe predator from the middle age of the dinosaur empire. She is a cousin of Megalosaurus. Her creator, Robbie Braun, spent a year making her. She's the latest full-size, all-moving dinosaur, and she's bound for an American museum.
It's almost like going back in time in your mind, but it's also a bit of being a detective. You compile the research based on scientific evidence, and you splice it all together, and hopefully at the end of the day you come out with something that people are in awe of.
And everything were, oh my God. Yeah.
It's a bit awkward.
Does it drool? Will it drool?
Eventually we're going to try to get some glycerin. It brings you closer to a wide variety of very beautiful beasts that once roamed the world. There's only one way you can do that. It's either through film or in real life. And museums, I think, should be about real life, things that you can touch, things that you can see that move. Here we have a series of valves.
For Ray Harryhausen, old-time Hollywood model maker, the world of moving dinosaurs has changed. Not only what they look like, but the just as impressive wizardry inside.
That makes the mouth open. That's marvelous.
Despite America's latest high-tech models, dinosaur detectives still learn from teeth. One of the earliest and distant ancestors of Allosaurus was Coelophysis. At 10 feet long with razor-sharp serrated teeth, it was the first fast, lean meat-eater. With sharp eyes, the slender legs of a sprinter, and a long tail for balance, Coelophysis ate anything that moved. In hard times, it even ate its own young.
It walked much like a bird, and that's what we seem to see here. So I'm assuming that the other one, the bigger one, was a male, and this size then would be the adult female size. So it comes across here with a good brisk step. Again, one track right dead in front of the other. The hip structure was quite advanced, nothing sprawling or ungainly about the animal.
In the mud of an ancient lakeside, Coelophysis, hunting in packs, left near-perfect footprints. The lake, now a quarry in Virginia, is one of the biggest sites of Coelophysis tracks ever found. Bob Weems is interpreting the evidence.
At this point, the thing may well have been doing somewhere between 15 or 20 miles an hour.
Now, how do you know that?
There is actually a formula that's been worked out to determine the speeds of dinosaurs. A fellow by the name of Alexander in Britain has worked it out. And what you need to know is the height of the hips and the spacing between the footprints, and by cranking this into a rather complicated formula, you can come up with a pretty good estimate of the speed of the animal. It's possible these things may have been coming through in some kind of a hunting formation, if you will, spread out over a long distance like maybe lions or wolves.
This is the footprint of a small meat-eating dinosaur called Coelophysis that lived 200 million years ago. Remarkable, but not nearly as remarkable as the fact that footprints just like this have been found 2,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean in Britain. How in the world, you might ask, could that be? How could a land animal, even a dinosaur, cross such a vast ocean? Of course, it didn't. The answer is locked in geological time when the Earth was a great deal younger. Across the Atlantic in Britain, dinosaur hunters are working on identical clues to the ones found in the quarry site in Virginia. Taken together, the clues from both countries reveal a picture of the physical world that dinosaurs lived in, far different from our own. Mike Bassett and his team are recording the evidence for the Museum of Wales before erosion washes it away.
They're all much the same size. Yeah. I mean, here's that trackway. Look, he's turning away, look, isn't he?
And he crosses another one coming the other way then.
The most important thing to remember in making reconstructions of this kind is that the continents as we know them today simply didn't exist. Southern Britain and North America were joined together as part of the supercontinent of Pangaea. There was no Atlantic Ocean at all.
200 million years ago, when the early dinosaurs roamed, the Earth was very different from today. No continents, just one land mass surrounded by water. Coelophysis wandered the land, but as it did so, imperceptible changes were taking place. The land mass was beginning to break up, but very slowly, just an inch or so each year, spreading dinosaurs onto every continent of today's world.
It wasn't exactly a stroll, it was still a few 100 kilometers minimum, a few thousand kilometers. The main thing to remember, there was no ocean in between. It was a continuous landmass. And because it was land, animals like the dinosaurs and all the other animals living on that continent were capable of wandering freely across the continental mass.
With its vicious teeth, Coelophysis hunted its prey across the land mass of its world. The fossil evidence that made the dinosaurs the most successful animals ever is only now coming to light.
Immediately after making that footprint, of course, the dinosaurs moved on. Eventually, those areas of wet mud dried up in the intense heat of the sun in the deserts that existed at that time. They dried up and the mud was baked hard, and the footprints themselves were therefore baked hard. And eventually, more mud was washed across the desert and covered those footprints. And they were trapped in all time. Now, if we look across here, we can actually stand right on the edge of one of the watering holes where Coelophysis came down to drink, perhaps every evening. We use structures like this in the rocks to interpret the environments that existed here across southern Britain about 210 million years ago. And this surface particularly tells us that we were standing right on the edge of the freshwater lake where Coelophysis came for his drink. We have these beautiful structures called ripple marks, and these were formed when the water at the edge of the lake just washed forward very gently and backwards again very gently to form this little symmetrical mound in the sand called a ripple. And it's these kinds of structures that we use in the rock record to interpret the environments that the dinosaurs lived in all that time ago. It was very hot to start with. Coelophysis and its relatives lived in the low hills just to the north of here, probably where there was vegetation and probably therefore where it was slightly cooler. But the big problem he had, I would think, was that there was very little water around. And so he came down onto the hot desert flats when there were flash floods that flooded the lakes and flooded the streams, and he was able to use these environments to water.
Well, of course, especially towards evening time, like now or a little later, when the shadows get long, you almost sort of expect one of them to come tromping by you in the dark. It's just a flat open expanse like now. And with the tracks sitting here looking almost like they were made last week, you really get the feeling that they might just come right back by. It's almost amazing that they don't.
We now have a mass of evidence about Coelophysis and how it lived.
And then once it got here, it kind of swung over towards the right.
Dinosaur detectives have identified over 1,000 different species. At any one time, hundreds of thousands of dinosaurs would have existed together. But the early pioneers had few clues to the enormous variety that made up the kingdom of the dinosaurs. Then in 1878, in the sleepy Belgian town of Bernissart, miners working deep underground thought they had struck gold. Alas for them, they had found fool's gold, part of the disintegrating remains of fossil bones, worthless to them, but a veritable treasure trove to the dinosaur detectives. There were teeth, hands, heads, feet, broken limbs, and whole skeletons. Here in Belgium, for the first time, the bony remains of a whole herd of 39 complete skeletons of iguanodon. On every jaw was a wide set of teeth. Each one was identical to the teeth Dr. Mantell had found in England 60 years earlier. To Louis Dollo, an engineer, fell the task of reconstructing the complete animals.
And so, after 50 years of struggling with incomplete specimens, at last, Dollo had this one opportunity, a virtual Aladdin's cave of dinosaurs discovered in this little village at Bernissart. On the basis of all this wonderful material, he was able, for the first time, to reconstruct complete dinosaurs. Dollo was an obsessive man. He had a very narrow focus on dinosaurs. He wasn't just interested in the shapes of the bones. He was interested more in the way these were actually put together to make a real living, breathing animal. The methods that had been established by his forebear was that you needed a comparison. You needed something like it living today.
Dollo looked to birds, not lizards or big mammals, for a modern comparison. He chose the emu, with its upright posture and three-toed foot, as his blueprint for reconstruction.
It's not surprising, therefore, to find in the old archive photographs and paintings that the little models that lay beside the skeletons as Dollo began to reconstruct this animal were of an emu and a wallaby. And sure enough, that is exactly what these dinosaurs tend to look like.
Simply preparing such a massive find took 10 men 12 years.
It required a huge laboratory, and so Dollo had a big team of workers and conservators actually involved in the simple chipping out of these specimens. Dollo did two very important things when he was reconstructing these dinosaurs. First of all, he had complete skeletons, which allowed him to do classic dinosaur restorations using armatures to actually produce a mounted skeleton, which provided the first visual image of dinosaurs. The other thing which he did, which was really quite unique, was to actually use some of the skeletons collected in Renaissance and reconstruct them as they would have appeared in death. Instead of just considering isolated bones as being of interest, he says, what are those bones for? He was not only interested in the ancient remains, but he was interested in this branch that would allow us to look at the shape and structure of bones and interpret those in the way that we look at living animals. He really tried, in the best way that he could, to bring these animals truly back to life.
In 1990, the most complete skeleton of the king of dinosaurs was uncovered in America at a dig in Montana. Researchers took weeks to dig out and prepare for travel to the lab the bones of the fiercest dinosaur of all time, Tyrannosaurus rex.
The animal died in a stream bed, and the lower jaw had separated from the skull up there.
How large was the whole animal?
We're guesstimating right now that it was probably about 40 feet. We're missing portions of the tail, but everything else seems to be here. Well, what we want to do is take a look at the animal. Well, by looking at the teeth, we have a good idea of what it did for a living. It ate meat.
Weighing in at 3.5 tons and armed with 6-inch teeth, T-Rex always has been seen as too big and slow for the chase, only driven by hunger to go in search of rotting carcasses. Now dinosaur detectives in Montana have new clues, the first ever complete arms of T-Rex, which reveal they were not as tiny and useless as we first thought. Today we see him as a lurking predator waiting to ambush his victim.
We have the upper arm here. We have the two lower arms, which correspond to these bones here, and then we have a hand. And it did confirm, in fact, that Tyrannosaurus rex did have the two fingers. If we then move the finger bones through their arc of motion, what we discover is that the thumb claw could then embed deep into the body of the prey, so that if the prey is struggling, then the prey will essentially impale itself deeper on the claw and would not be able to pull itself free.
Matt, I understand that in reconstructing a model of this, you determined that there was a lot more strength in these things than had ever been believed before.
We estimated that it could hold about 426 pounds.
Oh,
Right.
Okay. How much can a weightlifter, an Arnold Schwarzenegger, hold, do you suppose?
Well, I'm not sure, but with this arm here, we did the same methods, and we came out with about 41 pounds.
We believe that Tyrannosaurus then would grab its prey and latch onto it with the claws digging into the body of the prey, and the prey would be struggling, but it couldn't get away. The thumb claw would essentially dig deeper as the animal preyed. And with that big head up there, essentially with the prey very close to the body, it was very easy for the head to come down and essentially to bite down to kill its prey. And with those big muscles on top of the neck, then it could probably rip and essentially kill its prey in that fashion.
You're making Tyrannosaurus Rex sound like a pretty mean beast.
He was definitely the king of the beasts.
From only 8 skeletons ever found, we now know that T. rex was an intelligent, finely balanced animal with powerful hind legs, acute vision, and a voracious appetite. His jaws were lined with teeth which were long, sharp, and curved. They are the largest teeth of any meat eater that has ever lived. Teeth very similar to those of Tyrannosaurus were those described by William Buckland, who began our detective story, and in one sense at least, brings our story full circle, for T. rex lived right at the close of the reign of the dinosaurs. So, Paul, that's how dinosaurs were discovered. A few brave and clever men overturned our view of our world. It's older and far richer in creatures long vanished than we'd ever imagined. They found the skeletons all right, but skeletons, you know, don't really tell us very much about flesh and muscle and skin and color, do they? What do these things really look like? Well, our dinosaur detectives are going to tell us next time.